The day Adaugo Nwofor turned down Obika Osei, she did it in front of people. That was the part nobody forgot. Not just that she said no, but how she said it, where she said it, and what she said when she said it. She did it at the market, on a Saturday morning, in front of the egusi sellers and the tomato women and the 4 men who played drafts every morning by the water pipe and who had nothing better to do than watch whatever was happening. Obika had come to the market. Not to buy. He came for her. He had been working up to this for 3 months. 3 months of small conversations, of offering to help carry things, of bringing her water when her stand was far from the tap, of coming by just before closing time and walking beside her to the road. 3 months. And she had been polite. Not warm, but polite, which he had mistaken for permission. He came that Saturday with nothing in his hand. No gift. No elaborate setup. Just himself. In his work clothes. Because he had come from work. He worked at the construction yard at the edge of town. He drove a forklift. He wore the dust of the construction yard in his hair and on his boots. He came in his work clothes because he had thought, she knows what I do. She knows what I have. I will not dress it up as something it is not. He came. He stood at her stall. He said, Adaugo. She said, Obika. He said, I want to talk to you. She said, about what? He said, about us. She looked at him. Then she looked around at the market, at the people who were already beginning to pay attention. She looked at his dusty boots, at his work clothes, at the man in front of her, who had no car, who rented a single room, who drove a forklift for a living, who had come to tell her about us. She said, loud enough for the market to hear, Obika, you are a good man. But I have told you before, I am looking for a man with something to offer, not a forklift driver who rents one room. I cannot build a future on nothing. Silence. The kind that comes when words land somewhere they should not have been thrown. Obika stood very still. He did not reply angrily. He did not beg. He said, okay. He turned. He walked out of the market. He did not look back. And the market went back to its noise. And Adaugo went back to her tomatoes. And the 4 men at the drafts board watched him go. And one of them, old Papa Yugachukwu, who had been in that market since before anyone could remember, said quietly, that girl has just made the biggest mistake of her life. Nobody asked him what he meant. They would not have believed him anyway. Not yet. If that opening just made something twist in your chest, if you already feel the shape of what is coming for Adaugo, hit that like button right now and subscribe to this channel. We tell the stories that remind you that what a person appears to be and what they actually are can be miles apart. Subscribe right now. Drop in the comments where you are watching from tonight. Every country, every city, every person who has ever been dismissed for what they had instead of who they were. We want you here. Subscribe, drop your location, and let us go all the way back to the beginning. Adaugo Nwofor was 26 years old. She was from Ozubulu in Anambra State. She had come to Onitsha at 22 to trade, starting small, a tomato stall at the main market, then adding pepper, then onions, then stockfish, building, not fast, but building. She was good at it. She had a nose for prices. She knew when to buy and when to wait. She knew which suppliers to trust and which ones measured light. She had built something small but real in 4 years. She was proud of it, not in a showing-off way, in the way of someone who has built something with their hands and knows the cost of every stone. But, and this is the thing about Adaugo, the thing that organized everything else about her, she had been poor once. Not just modest. Poor. Her father had died when she was 14. Her mother had taken over his kiosk business. A small provision kiosk. Barely enough. There had been a year when Adaugo wore the same 2 uniforms to school because there was no money for a third. There had been months when the kiosk profit was all that stood between the family and asking. And asking was the thing her mother had taught her to never do. Not because asking was wrong, but because of what asking meant. Depending. Being dependent on someone else's decision to be generous. Being at the mercy of another person's choice. Her mother had said, Adaugo, Make yourself a life that does not require someone else to choose to save you. She had absorbed this completely, and then she had overcorrected. The way people do when a lesson that was meant to teach strength becomes a wall. She had decided that poverty was a choice, not a circumstance. A choice. That people who were poor had made decisions that led there. And she was not going to make those decisions. She was not going to be poor again. She was not going to marry poor. She was not going to let love make her foolish about the practical things. She was going to be strategic. She was going to build, and then she was going to choose from the built place. From a position of strength. A man who came to her in dusty boots and a work shirt and one rented room and no car was not what she was building toward. Regardless of how many times he walked beside her to the road, she had made her decision. She had stated it publicly. She had moved on. Or so she told herself. But there was something about the way he left. The okay. Just okay. No argument. No anger. No attempting to make her feel guilty. No scene. Just okay. And then the back of him walking out of the market. Straight. Not defeated. Not embarrassed. Just walking. The way a person walks when they are done with something. Not when they have been broken. When they have been told something they have decided to believe and are moving forward from. She thought about it more than she expected to. Not obsessively. Just more than nothing. Which she noticed. She said to herself, "You made the right decision." She said it a few times. Which should not have been necessary if it was the right decision. But she said it. And she went on. 3 weeks later, a woman came to her stall. Not a regular customer. She was wearing a well-cut Ankara dress. Proper shoes. Not market shoes. Going somewhere shoes. She bought 2 kilos of tomatoes. She paid without haggling, which was the first unusual thing. Then she said, "Are you Adaugo Nwofor?" She said, "Yes." The woman said, "I am Mama Chinello. I sell fabrics in the south section." She said, "Okay." The woman said, "I want to tell you something. Not to make trouble. Just because I think you should know." She said, "What?" The woman said, "The man. The one you turned down at the market 3 weeks ago." Something in Adaugo's chest moved. She said, "Obika." The woman said, "Yes." She said, "What about him?" The woman said, "He is not who you think he is." She said, "What do you mean?" The woman said, "He is not just a forklift driver." She said, "What is he?" The woman paused. She said, "He owns the construction yard." Adaugo stared at her. She said, "He owns." The woman said, "Osei Construction. The entire yard. The equipment. The contracts. The operation." She said, "That is not possible." The woman said, "It is very possible. My husband works there. He has worked there for 5 years. He has known Obika Osei for 5 years. He did not tell me who he was at first because he said, 'Let me see if the market has changed.' He was testing something." Adaugo said, "Testing what?" The woman said, "I don't know exactly. But my husband says he does this. He lives simply. He drives the forklift himself sometimes. He eats with the workers. He does not separate himself." She said, "Why?" The woman said, "My husband thinks it is because he had nothing once. And he does not want to become the kind of person who forgets what nothing feels like." Adaugo stood at her stall, with her tomatoes, in the Onitsha main market. She stood very still. The woman looked at her. She said, "I am not telling you to go after him. I don't know what the right thing is. I just thought you should know." She said, "Thank you." The woman went. Adaugo did not sell many tomatoes that afternoon. She sat at her stall. She thought. She went to Papa Ugachukwu, the old man at the drafts board. She found him in his usual place. She sat down beside him. He looked at her. He did not say anything. She said, "You said I made the biggest mistake of my life." He said, "Did I?" She said, "That morning, when he left the market." He said, She said, "Did you know who he was?" Papa Ugachukwu moved a piece on the board. He said, "I have been in this market for 31 years. She said, "Did you know?" He said, "I knew he was not what he appeared." She said, "How?" He said, "Because of how he walked. A man with nothing walks one way. A man with something who has chosen to look like nothing walks a different way. She said, "What is the difference?" He said, "The man with nothing looks forward. He is watching for opportunity, always scanning. The man who has chosen to look like nothing looks present. He is watching what is here, not what might come." She said, "He looked present." He said, "Yes." She said, "I didn't notice." He said, "No. You looked at his boots." She was quiet. He said, "Adaugo, I am going to tell you something." She said, "Please." He said, "You were not wrong to want a man with something. That is wisdom. A woman who has built something deserves a man who has built something." She said, "But..." He said, "But you looked at the wrong things. His boots, his work clothes, his one room. These are things about his current display, not about who he is." She said, "I should have looked deeper." He said, "You should have asked a different question." She said, "What question?" He said, "Not, what does he have? But, what kind of person is he?" Those two questions have different answers, and only one of them tells you about the future. She said, "I asked the wrong question." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I asked it in public." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Is there something I can do?" He looked at her. He said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want to apologize." He said, "For rejecting him?" She said, "For how I rejected him. For the public part. For the forklift driver remark." He said, "Those are different apologies." She said, "I know." He said, "Which one do you want to make?" She said, "Both." He looked at her. He moved another piece. He said, "Then find him." She found him. Not easily. She went to the construction yard. She stood at the entrance. She had never been to the yard before. It was larger than she expected. A proper operation. Equipment. Workers. A site office. A board with the company name painted professionally. Osei Construction Ltd. She stood at the gate. A security man came. She said, "I am looking for Obika Osei." He said, "Do you have an appointment?" She said, "No." He said, "He is not available to visitors without." She said, "Tell him Adaugo Nwofor from the market is here." The security man looked at her. He went inside. He came back. He said, "Come." He brought her to the site office. She walked in. Obika was behind a desk, in a different set of clothes. Still not flashy, but the clothes of someone in an office. He looked up. He saw her. He said nothing for a moment. He said, "Sit down, Adaugo." She sat. He said, "How can I help you?" Not warmly, not coldly, professionally. The way a man receives someone who is not quite a stranger and not quite a known person. She said, "I came to apologize." He said, "For what exactly?" She said, "For what I said at the market." He said, "You said what you felt." She said, "I said what I saw," which was not the full picture. He said, "You did not know the full picture." She said, "No." He said, "So the apology is for the manner, not the decision." She looked at him. She said, "Yes. And also for the decision." He said, "Why also for the decision? You are allowed to say no to anyone." She said, "I know." She said, "But the reason I gave was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of untrue at the time. Wrong in the sense of shallow. I looked at the surface and made a judgment. And that judgment was unkind, and it was public, and it was wrong." He was quiet. He looked at his desk. He said, "Who told you?" She said, "A woman from the fabric section. Her husband works here." He said, "Mama Chinello." She said, "Yes." He nodded slowly. He said, "What do you want, Adaugo? An apology accepted is one thing. What do you want after that?" She said, "I don't know yet." He said, "Honest." She said, "I came to apologize. I don't think it is appropriate to come asking for more than the receiving of the apology." He looked at her. Something moved in his face. Not warmth. Consideration. He said, "You did not come because you found out who I am and changed your mind." She said, "I came because I behaved badly. The discovering of who you are only clarified the shape of the bad behavior." It did not change what the behavior was. He said, "Explain that." She said, "If you had been exactly what you appeared, a forklift driver, one room, no car, I still should not have said what I said in public. I should have been private, respectful. I had the right to say no. I did not have the right to say it the way I said it." He said, "And the substance of it? The content? That you want a man with something?" She said, "That is not wrong." He said, "No." She said, "But it was the wrong question to ask about you specifically." He said, "Why wrong about me specifically?" She said, "Because you had something. I just was not looking at the right things." He said, "You did not know that." She said, "No. But there were signs. If I had been paying attention to the right things." He said, "Like what?" She thought about what Papa Yugachuku had said. She said, "The way you walked." He looked at her. She said, "A man who has nothing walks one way. A man who has chosen to look like nothing walks differently." He said, "Who told you that?" She said, "Papa Yugachuku." He said, "Old Yugo." She said, "You know him?" He said, "I know everyone in that market. I have been buying from those stalls for 3 years." She said, 3 years. He said, "Yes." She said, "And I did not know." He said, "No." She said, "Why did you come the way you came? To the market in work clothes? No car?" "No." He said, "Would you like to know the real reason?" She said, "Yes." He leaned back. He said, "My father built a business when I was young. He built it from nothing. Absolute nothing. He used to say, 'I am proudest of what I built before anyone knew my name.'" She said, "And after they knew your name?" He said, "After they knew, everything changed. The people around him changed. The women around him changed. The relationships, the requests, the quality of the truth he received." He said, "The worst thing wealth does to a person is not make them arrogant. It is make them lonely. Because you can never be sure again who sees you and who sees what you have." She said, "And so you tested." He said, "I did not come to the market to test anyone specifically. I came because the market was near the yard and the food was good, and I liked the noise of it." He said, "But when I found someone interesting, yes. I let the interesting happen as myself. As Obika with the dusty boots. Not as Obika with the company name." She said, "Because you wanted to know who would stay." He said, "Who would see?" She said, "There is a difference." He said, "There is every difference." She sat in that office for a long time. Longer than she planned. They talked. Not about the rejection. Not about the apology. About other things. About what she was building at the market. About her mother's kiosk. About the year of the 2 school uniforms. He listened to her the way he had always listened at the stall. But now she was looking back. Not at his boots. At his face. At the quality of the listening. She noticed what she had not noticed before. He was not a man who listened to be polite. He listened to understand. There was a difference. She saw it now. She had not seen it before. Because she had been looking at his boots. She said, "I was a fool." He said, "You were working with the information you had prioritized." She said, "That is polite for. You were a fool." He said, "You were wrong about the specifics. Not about the principle." She said, "The principle." He said, "That you deserve a man who has built something. That is true. It was always true. You just misidentified which things counted as built." She said, "Boots and cars." He said, "Versus?" She said, "Character. Steadiness. What a man does when he has something and nobody knows." He said, "And what a man does when he has nothing and everybody watches." She said, "Is that what you were doing? At the market? Seeing what people do when they think the man has nothing?" He said, "Not consciously, but yes." She said, "And what did you see?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "I saw a woman who built something from nothing and who had mistaken her fear of returning to nothing for clarity about what mattered." She stared at him. She said, "That is." He said, "Too much?" She said, "Accurate." He said, "Yes." She said, "I was afraid." He said, Yes. She said, of being poor again. He said, and so you made safety look like ambition. And ambition made you cruel in a moment that required only respect. She said nothing for a while. She said, you have been thinking about me. He said, I have been thinking about what happened. Yes. She said, and what have you concluded? He said, that you are not a bad person who did a bad thing. You are a person who has a wound that is running the part of you that should be making decisions. She said, the poverty fear. He said, yes. She said, is that something you can look past? He said, that depends. She said, on what? He said, on whether the person with the wound knows it's there. She said, I know it's there. He said, now you do. She said, I may have known before. I just didn't admit it. He said, that is more honest. She said, I'm trying to be more honest. He said, I can see that. She said, Obika. He said, yes. She said, I would like to start again. He said, define starting again. She said, getting to know you properly. Without the surface things. Without the boots or the car or the company name matching. He said, you say that now. She said, I know how it sounds. He said, it sounds like you found out I have money and now you want to start again. She said, I know. She said, and I cannot prove that is not what this is. I understand that. She said, but let me try to say it differently. He said, say it. She said, the apology was for the manner. The manner was wrong regardless of who you are. The manner would have been wrong if you had been exactly what you appeared. She said, the asking to start again is separate. It is because, sitting here, I can see the person I should have been seeing for 3 months. Not the boots. Not the dust. The way you listened. The way you thought. The fact that you drive your own forklift and eat with your workers. She said, those things. Those are the things I should have been seeing. He said, and you want to see them now. She said, I want to be the kind of person who sees them, whether or not you allow me to see them in you. He looked at her. She looked back. She said, I understand if you say no. He said, do you? She said, you owe me nothing. I made a decision publicly. You walked out with your dignity. You are under no obligation to give me a second chance. He said, and yet you are asking. She said, because the alternative is walking out of this office having said the right words and returning to being the same person who looked at boots. He said, you want to change. She said, I want to be better. He said, for what reason? She said, because the kind of person I was that morning at the market is not the kind of person I want to be. Whether or not you ever speak to me again. He was quiet for a long time. He looked at the desk. He looked at the window. He looked at her. He said, you are going to have to do something for me. She said, what? He said, not for me specifically. For yourself. But in front of me. She said, tell me. He said, go back to the market. Not to announce anything. Not to perform anything. Go back and talk to old Ugachukwu. Ask him to tell you about the people in that market. The real stories. Who they are, not what they have. She said, why? He said, because the market is full of people you have been looking at with the wrong question. And if you can start asking the right question there, about everyone, not just about me, then the change is real. She said, and then? He said, then we will see. She went back to the market. She found Papa Ugachukwu. She sat beside him at the drafts board. She said, tell me about the people here. He looked at her. He said, all of them. She said, start where you want. He started. He talked for 2 hours. About the woman who sold stockfish, who had put 3 children through university from that stall. About the man who pushed a wheelbarrow for hire, who had sent money to his village to build a clinic for 11 years. About the young girl who sold groundnuts, who had been her village's only secondary school graduate in a decade. About person after person, in the market, whom Adaugo had looked at and seen the surface, and whose surface was not the story. She listened. She wrote things down, not because she planned to use the information, because the writing was her way of saying, This matters. By the time Papa Yugachukwu was done, the afternoon was ending. She sat at the drafts board. She said, I have been here 4 years and I did not know any of this. He said, You were not looking for it. She said, No. He said, What were you looking for? She said, Prices, opportunities, supply. He said, You found all of those. She said, Yes. He said, But you missed the rest. She said, Yes. He said, And the rest? She said, The rest is the actual thing. He said, Yes. She sat for a while. She said, Papa Yugachukwu. He said, Yes. She said, The morning he walked out of the market. When I had said what I said. He walked straight. He said, Yes. She said, Not like he was hurt. He said, No. She said, Why? He said, Because a man who knows who he is does not require your knowledge of it to remain standing. She said, He knew who he was. He said, He has always known. She said, And I didn't. He said, You knew who you were afraid of being again. You did not yet know who you were becoming. She said, And who am I becoming? He looked at her. He said, I am not the right person to answer that. She said, Who is? He said, You. And the people you decide to actually look at from now on. She went back to the yard. Not immediately. 2 weeks later. She sent a message through Mama Chinello. She said, I went to the market. I talked to Papa Yugachukwu. I am ready to tell you what I found. He replied, Come Saturday. She went. She sat in the office again. She told him what she had found. Not just the stories Yugachukwu had told, but what she had seen herself. In the 2 weeks since, she had been going back. Every morning. Not just to her stall, but to the market. Walking through it differently. Asking different questions. She had learned things. She had been humbled by things. She told him all of it. He listened. When she finished, he said, And what changed? She said, I stopped looking at what people have. I started looking at what people have done with what they had. He said, Difference. She said, The stockfish woman built a university for 3 children from a market stall. The wheelbarrow man built a clinic 11 years of hard work at a time. Neither of them had what I would have called impressive. She said, But both of them built more than I have built. He said, That is not necessarily. She said, I don't mean the money or the size. I mean the generosity. The building for something beyond themselves. I have been building for safety. They have been building for more than themselves. He said, And you? She said, I want to build for more than myself. He said, What does that look like? She said, I don't know yet. But it starts with not walking around the market looking at people's boots. He said, Yes. She looked at him. She said, Obika. He said, Yes. She said, I want to ask you about your father. He said, What about him? She said, He said the worst thing wealth does is make you lonely. That you can never be sure who sees you and who sees what you have. He said, Yes. She said, Is that what it has been like for you? He was quiet. He said, More than I expected. She said, The yard has been growing for 5 years? He said, 6. She said, And in 6 years? He said, In 6 years I have had many relationships. Business, personal, and the quality of every one of them changed the moment people understood what the yard was. She said, Changed how? He said, The attention increased. The warmth increased. The interest in my opinions increased dramatically. She said, He said, But the person did not change. The person was the same person who drove a forklift before he owned the yard. I am the same person. And the people who become warm when they understand the yard, they are not becoming warm about me. She said, They are becoming warm about the yard. He said, Yes. She said, And the market? He said, Was real. Nobody knew. Whatever happened there was about the person. She said, Including what I did. He said, Yes. She said, I gave you the real response. He said, You gave me the most honest response anyone had given me in 3 years. She said, It was unkind. He said, It was honest. Honesty is not always kind. But kindness that is not honest is not kindness. It is management. She said, "You sound like the woman in Uzoe's." He looked at her. She said, "Nothing. Something I heard." He said, "Adaugo." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am going to tell you something." She said, "Tell me." He said, "When you walked into my office the first time, when you apologized, I had already decided that you were a person I would not pursue again. The rejection had been clear. The public nature of it had been hurtful in a way I did not expect." She said, "I know." He said, "But the way you apologized." She said, "Tell me." He said, "You did not apologize for rejecting me. You apologized for the manner. You separated the two things. And you were correct to separate them. And the correctness of that separation told me something about you." She said, "What did it tell you?" He said, "That you are capable of precision about difficult things. That you can hold two things at once without collapsing them into each other. The right to say no, and the wrong way of saying it. Most people would have collapsed them. Apologized for both, or for neither." She said, "You were watching." He said, "I am always watching." She said, "The way you walk through the market." He said, "Yes." She said, "What else did you see?" "When I apologized," he said, "I saw someone who had been thinking, not just reacting. Someone who had gone away and sat with something uncomfortable and come back with something specific. That takes a particular kind of courage." She said, "It did not feel like courage." He said, "It never does." They met again and again, not as suitor and potential, as two people getting to know each other. Slowly, without the surface things. She came to the yard. He came to the market, not to her stall. He came to the whole market, walking with her, the way he had always walked with her. Except now she was walking back. She met his workers. He met the stockfish woman. She met his foreman, a man named Dubum, who had worked with him for 6 years and who said of him, without knowing she was listening, "That man is the fairest person I have ever worked for. He never forgets where he came from, never treats us like we are beneath him. And that is the rarest thing in a man who has built something." She stood behind a supply crate, and she heard this. And she thought about Mama Ezen, about old Ugachukwu, about the wheelbarrow man and the clinic, about the quality of people who did good things quietly, who built for more than themselves, who did not require the world to know what they were to remain who they were. She thought, "I have been surrounded by these people." She thought, "I was looking at the wrong things." He took her to Aka, to his family compound. Not formally. He said, "I want you to see where I came from." They drove together. He drove himself. A modest car. Not the most modest thing he owned. But not the thing a person who wanted to impress would drive. She noticed. She said, "You have other cars." He said, "Yes." She said, "You chose this one." He said, "I always choose this one." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because the other ones attract a kind of attention I find exhausting." She said, "The wrong kind." He said, "The kind that is about the car and not about the person in it." She looked out the window. She said, "I understand that better now." He said, "I know." They drove. He said, "My mother will be direct with you." She said, "I prefer direct." He said, "She will ask about your family, your work, what you want." She said, "Good questions." He said, "She may also ask about the market." She said, "The rejection." He said, "Yes." She said, "Does she know about it?" He said, "She knows everything about my life." She said, "Then she already has a picture." He said, "Yes." She said, "Is it an accurate picture?" He said, "The facts are accurate." She said, "But," he said, "the context may be missing." She said, "The poverty fear." He said, "And what you have done since." She said, "I would like to tell her myself." He said, "I was hoping you would say that." His mother was a tall woman, Adaugo Osei. She had the quality of someone who had seen much and revised her positions accordingly. She received Adaugo with the specific attention of a woman who loves her son and is watching the person her son has brought. not with hostility, with precision. She served them food. She sat. She said, "Adaugo, you told my son he was a forklift driver with nothing to offer." She said it without softening. Adaugo said, "Yes, Ma." The older woman said, "And now you are here." She said, "Yes, Ma." She said, "Tell me the difference between then and now." Adaugo looked at the woman. She said, "The difference is that I now know the difference between what a person has and who a person is. And I have been building my life on the wrong measure." The woman said, "Because you were afraid." She said, "Because I was afraid. And I turned the fear into a rule. And the rule was not wrong in spirit, but was wrong in application." She said, "How was it wrong in application?" Adaugo said, "I was looking for what a man displayed, not what a man was. And the display was a test I did not know was a test." The woman said, "And if the display had been correct? If he had come to the market in a good car and good clothes and presented as successful?" Adaugo was quiet. She said, "I would have been interested." The woman said, "For the right reasons?" She said, "For the wrong reasons." The woman looked at her. She said, "And now?" She said, "Now I have been to the market differently. I have sat with the people there, the ones I was walking past every day, the stockfish woman and the wheelbarrow man and the girls selling groundnuts. I have heard their stories. I have seen what it looks like to build something real over time, for more than yourself." She said, "And your son. I have seen what it looks like to be a man who has something and does not use it to separate himself from the people who helped him build it." She said, "That is what I want. Not what he has, who he is." The woman was quiet. For a long moment. She said, "My husband told him. Before he died. He said, 'Find someone who can see you when you look like nothing. Because that is the only way to know the seeing is real.'" She said, "That is why he came to the market the way he came." Adaugo said, "Yes. He told me." The woman said, "You failed the test." She said, "Yes." She said, "And then you came back." She said, "Yes." The woman said, "Why did you come back?" She said, "Because failing a test does not have to be the last thing about me. Because who I was that morning at the market is not all I am. Because the better question is not whether I failed, but whether I learned." The woman was quiet. She looked at her son. He was looking at Adaugo, with the particular look of a man who is watching someone do exactly what he hoped they would do, but did not know if they could. His mother said, "Did you learn?" Adaugo said, "I am learning." She said, "Still learning." "Not learned." She said, "Still." "Yes." The woman said, "Good." She picked up her fork. She said, "Eat." Adaugo ate. The market found out. Of course it did. Markets find out everything. Someone saw them together. Someone recognized the car. Someone asked a question to the right person. And the story traveled. The way stories travel in markets. Fast and not always accurate and full of additions. The story went. Adaugo Nwofor, who rejected the forklift driver, is now with the man who owns the whole yard. Some people said, "Serves her right that she almost missed it." Some people said, "She didn't miss it though, did she? She found out, and she went to him, and now look." Some people said, if she had not found out, she would never have gone back. The last group was the most interesting to Adaugo, because they were not entirely wrong. She had not gone back before finding out. She had gone back because she found out, and the finding out had shown her something was wrong with her looking. And then she had done something with what she found. She sat with the complexity of this. One evening, she was at her stall. After hours, the market was quieting. She sat. She thought, would I have gone back if I had not found out who he was? She was honest with herself. She did not know. She thought, I should have gone back before the finding out. I should have apologized for the manner regardless of who he turned out to be. She thought, but I did not. She thought, I went back because of what I found out. And then she thought, but after I found out, the apology I gave was not about what I found out. The apology was for the manner, which was wrong regardless. She thought, is that enough? She thought about it for a long time. She decided, The apology was honest. Whether or not I would have made it without the catalyst. She decided, the change is real. Whether or not it was started by the finding out. She decided, what matters is what I do with what I know. Not whether I would have learned it without the push. The push happened. I had to decide what to do with it. I chose to go back. I chose to look differently. I chose to sit with Yugachukwu. I chose to walk through the market with new questions. Those choices. Those are mine. Regardless of what pushed me toward them. She told Obika this. She told him about the market stall. After hours. About the sitting and the thinking. About the honest question she had asked herself. About what she had concluded. He listened. He said, you told me you might not have gone back. She said, without the finding out. Yes. I don't know. He said, that is honest. She said, I am trying to be more honest. He said, I know. He said, I want to tell you something. She said, tell me. He said, I went to the market for 3 years. She said, I know. He said, in that time I watched many people. I had many conversations. I learned who most of the regular traders were. She said, yes. He said, I came to you because of the way you worked. She said, what way? He said, precise. Attentive. You knew your prices without looking at a paper. You knew which tomatoes were going to turn faster and which would hold. You knew the market the way someone knows a thing they have paid attention to. She said, that is just the work. He said, yes. But the quality of the attention tells you about the person. She said, I pay attention to the work. He said, you pay attention to things that matter to you. The question I was asking was, what matters to you? She said, the market. He said, the building. Yes. The work itself. But also. He said, do you remember the morning the tomato girl dropped her basket? She said, which morning? He said, 2 years ago. A young girl. She dropped her whole basket of tomatoes near your stall. They scattered everywhere. She said, I remember. He said, what did you do? She thought. She said, I helped her pick them up. He said, and? She said, I replaced what was damaged. From my stock. He said, without being asked. She said, she was crying. She looked like she needed. He said, you did it without calculation. You saw something needed and you did the thing. She said, it was just tomatoes. He said, it was never just tomatoes. He looked at her. He said, I knew then that the person who looked at my boots was not the whole of you. She said, you saw that before. He said, before the 3 months of walking to the road. Yes. She said, you were watching me. He said, I watch everyone. That is who I am. She said, and you still came. Even knowing I would probably. He said, I came because the part of you that helped the girl was real. And I wanted to see if the part of you that looked at boots could be reached. She said, you were testing. He said, I was hoping. She said, and when I failed. He said, when you failed, I walked out. Because a man who knows who he is does not require your knowledge of it to remain standing. She said, Papa Yugachukwu said almost exactly that. He said, old Yugo taught me that. Years ago. She said, you know him. He said, he knows everyone's story, including mine. She said, he knew who you were? He said, since the beginning. He said nothing because the knowing was mine to share. She said, he watched me reject you. He said, yes. She said, and he still helped me. He said, because he saw what I saw. She said, what? He said, the girl helping pick up tomatoes. That is who you are underneath the fear. And the fear can change. The underneath doesn't. She sat very still. She said, Obika. He said, yes. She said, I love you. The words came out simply. Without drama. Without build-up. Just the truth. The way simple truths come when you have stopped performing. He looked at her. He said, I know. She said, is that all you have? He said, I have been in love with you since the morning with the tomatoes. She said, 2 years. He said, 2 years. She said, and you came to the market for 2 years without telling me. He said, I was building toward it. She said, in your work clothes and your dusty boots. He said, yes. She said, which is the most ridiculous and the most honest thing I have ever heard. He said, yes. She laughed. Real. Full. Not the market laugh. Not the performance laugh. The real one. He watched her laugh. He said, that is the laugh. She said, what laugh? He said, the one I have been waiting to cause. They married. Not in a spectacle. Not in the way that announcements of wealth and good taste are made. They married in Adaugo's mother's compound in Ozubulu. In the style of the family. With the food from the market. The stockfish woman sent fish. Papa Yugachukwu came. He sat in the front. In his best cloth. With the particular expression of a man who has watched a story for years and is now watching its right ending arrive. He did not say, I told you. He did not need to. He knew. She knew. She caught his eye once across the gathering. He nodded. Once. That was enough. What changed? After the wedding. After the yard and the market and the building that happened in both. What changed was not Adaugo's ambition. She was still ambitious. She always would be. The market stall grew. She expanded. She learned from Obika how to think about the building in the larger sense. Not just today's prices. The direction of things. The longer picture. She was good at it. The ambition did not change. The question changed. Not, what does this person have? But, who is this person? What have they done with what they had? What do they build for? Just themselves or for more? These became her questions. Not just about men. About everyone. About her suppliers. About her customers. About the people she hired as the business grew. About herself. She asked them about herself often. What are you building for? Is it still just safety? Is it still the fear driving? Or is it the more than yourself driving? The answer changed over time. As she changed over time. And the changing was the whole point. The market knew the story. Of course it did. It became one of the market stories. The ones Papa Yugachukwu told. The ones that lived alongside the stockfish woman and the wheelbarrow man and the groundnut girls. He would tell it like this. There was a woman who looked at a man's boots and missed the man, and then found out who the man was, and went back not because of what he had, but because of who she wanted to be. And the man, who had been waiting 2 years for her to see him, saw that she was finally asking the right question, and said, come. He would tell it, and the young people at the market would listen, and the young women especially, would sit with the question that the story raised. Not, how do I find a rich man who looks poor? That was the wrong lesson. The right lesson was, what are the questions I am asking about people? And are they the right ones? What am I looking at? And is the looking at the right things? This is what the story teaches. Not about wealth and poverty. About looking. About the questions we use to measure people. And whether those questions reveal what matters. The fear of poverty is real. The desire for security is not shallow. These are legitimate things. But when the fear becomes the measure, when the desire for security becomes the only lens, then you look at boots and miss the man. You look at the display and miss the builder. You look at what is visible and miss what is true. And what is true about people, about their character, about their steadiness, about what they do when they have something and nobody is watching, about what they build for. About whether they are the kind of person who helps a girl pick up scattered tomatoes without calculating the cost. These true things are not in the boots. They are in the walking, not in the clothes. In the listening, not in the car. In the question, who are you? And what kind of person do you choose to be? Especially when the choice costs something. Especially when no one is watching. Especially when the market is full of drafts players and tomato sellers, and the four walls of the question can be heard by everyone. That is when character shows. Not in what you have, in what you do, with what you have, and with what you don't. You just watched a woman look at a man's boots, and missed the man. You watched her find out. And instead of just running back to the money, you watched her do something harder. You watched her go to the market differently. You watched her sit with Papa Yugachukwu. You watched her ask better questions. You watched her tell the truth about herself in a room where she didn't have to a mother who was watching, to a man who was waiting to see what she would do with the information. And you watched her not do it because the money was now visible, but because she had looked in the mirror and not liked who she saw at the market stall that Saturday morning, and decided she could be someone better. That is the story, not the money, the looking, not the wealth. The question: are you asking the right questions about the people in your life? Are you looking at boots? Or are you looking at how a man walks through a market when he thinks nobody knows what he has? Are you looking at displays? Or at what people do when the display is not required? If this story made something shift in you tonight, subscribe to this channel right now. Because we tell these stories. The ones that go underneath the obvious. The ones that ask, what are you actually measuring? And is it the right thing? The ones your grandparents carried. The ones the market women know. The ones Papa Yugachukwu has been telling for 31 years to people who were finally ready to hear them. Hit that subscribe button. Hit the like button if Adaugo's walk to the yard, not because of the money, but because she wanted to be better, made something rise in you. Drop in the comments where you are watching from tonight. And tell us this. Have you ever judged someone by the surface and then found out the real story? Have you ever been on the other side of that judgment? Tell us. Both sides. Because both sides are in this story. And both sides are in this community. Subscribe. Come back. We will be here. With the next man walking through the market in dusty boots. With the next woman sitting with the right question for the first time. With the next story that reminds you. The boots are not the man. The display is not the truth. Look deeper. Look longer. Ask the right question. Everything changes when you do.